Last time we spoke about Stalin's general offensive. Stalin, bolstered by early Moscow era and Ostov successes, ordered a broad encirclement strategy across multiple fronts: center, north, Leningrad, and Ukraine, aiming to drain German reserves before spring. General Zhukov warned that concentrated reserves and heavy tank support were essential, but Stalin and the Stavka pushed for a wide front offensive, overestimating the Red Army's strengths while underestimating logistics and fuel shortages. The result was a cascade of rushed operations, poor communication, poor coordination, and insufficient artillery support, tempered by pockets of resilience at lower levels. On the German side, logistical strain, winter conditions, and the Luftwaffe's varied effectiveness, and some stiff Soviet pressure forced an ad hoc German amount of withdrawals and rearguard actions. Brutal fighting broke out around Lake Inmen, Volkhov, and the Bryansk corridor, with dramatic German political military frictions and punitive measures for commanders who disobeyed or failed. This episode is Back to Königsberg. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. We can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I am now unleashing two miniseries, one covering the Taiping Rebellion, the other covering the 7 Years' War. And I'd like to add, the 7 Years' War miniseries is going to be quite interesting. It's going to be told by me from Quebec, my co-host who's from India, and a German individual who will be covering the European theater. I'll be covering the North American theater, and of course my co-host will be covering the Indian theater. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Soviet Army had launched relentless attacks across the USSR against Army Group North and against Army Group Center. Both groups had been driven into crisis, with breaches opening up at multiple points along their lines. Soviet formations continued to press deep behind German lines. Army Group Center faced a serious threat of encirclement, while von Manstein conducted attacks in Crimea. Now, after their 3-day rest, the Volkhov Front had restarted their offensive on the 13th. This time they fought with better organization and artillery support, although ammunition remained in short supply. Despite these improvements, the offensive still faced the challenge of being directed through roadless, snow-covered frozen swamplands. This further strained the already stretched logistics, causing extreme shortages of all supplies. Moreover, Meretskov once again failed to concentrate strength against single points, instead dispersing his efforts over a wide area. With the offensive not meeting expectations, Meretskov continually begged for further reinforcements throughout the entire week. On the 19th of January, Stavka sent 3,000 PPSH submachine guns, and I have to admit this kind of nerdy, stupid fact about me. I was really into Call of Duty World at War, and like most people of my pathetic generation, that's kind of how we learn about guns and war and such, and the PPSH was basically my favorite weapon in that game. Yes, a lot of hours in multiplayer with that bad boy. And might I add, I actually did a episode with a other group of YouTubers who are friends of mine, looking at Call of Duty World at War, which I called Call of Duty World of War Crimes for comical value. So if you go over to the Pacific War channel on YouTube, I do suggest giving it a watch. It is rather hilarious. But getting back to the point, they sent 3,000 PPSH submachine guns and 300 anti-tank rifles, and they released 9 ski battalions and an aerosleigh transport battalion to its control. The 2nd Shock Army moved to attack the junction of the 126th and 215th Infantry Divisions. The 126th had only recently arrived from France and was still acclimating to the harsh winter conditions. As the Soviet assault struck, they began to panic, allowing the 2nd Shock Army to push into the German defensive line. Yet the main strongpoints west of the Volkhov and the Dakota Rivers withstood the assault. The flanking 4th and 52nd Armies achieved even less, and both units shifted to a defensive posture by the 15th. After regrouping, Klakov launched another assault on the 17th. With the support of over 1,500 sorties from the VVS and the 2nd Shock Army, they managed to pierce the first layer of the German defenses and advanced up to 10 kilometers. Yet many vital German strongpoints remained standing, hindered by the same failures as before. As David Glantz would put it, poor command, control, and coordination, the dispersed nature of the assaults, and deteriorating weather conditions, suffering heavy losses. The Leningrad Front's 54th Army also attacked alongside the Volkhov Front, starting on the 13th. Vedyudinsky repeated Metskov's mistake by dispersing his offensive along the entire 30-kilometer front line rather than concentrating efforts on a single point. Despite undermining his own offensive, they managed to capture Pogotskaya by the 17th, confronting a heavily reinforced 269th Infantry Division. This small gain, however, did not suffice to breach the German defensive lines. The remainder of the Leningrad front stayed relatively quiet, with only a few minor attacks mounted from Leningrad and Oranienbaum. This allowed to pull sizable detachments from the 3 divisions on the siege lines to reinforce the divisions engaging the Volkhov front. The Luftwaffe and SS also dispatched detachments to the sector. This setback prompted Stalin to strip the 54th Army of its right flank to expand Sukhomlin's 8th Army. Both formations were ordered to smash the German defenses around Lodva. Afterwards, the 8th Army was to advance westward until it united with the 55th Army at Tosno. The 54th Army was still to advance to the southwest, join with the 2nd Shock Army at Luban, and then destroy the encircled Germans. Both armies failed to gain any meaningful ground during the week. Their only benefit had been to tie down German forces in the north. As soon as the Volkhov front had restarted its offensive, Halder immediately noted the increased pressure on Army Group North, which were already struggling with the fighting around Staraya Russa. He also recorded that Leib wanted to withdraw, but Hitler denied permission. Halder's war diary on January 13th read as such: "The southern wing of Army Group North came under heavy pressure today as a result of the attack against the 123rd Division by elements of 4 divisions across the frozen lakes. Von Leib is at once thinking of withdrawing. The Führer disapproves." Halder reasoned that a withdrawal would create a massive gap between Army Group North and Army Group Center. This forced Leib to issue an ultimatum on the 15th. Either he would be relieved, or he would be granted permission to retreat south of Lake Min. Leib asked either that he be relieved or that he be allowed to order the retreat south of Lake Min, while he still had some room for maneuver, put all of the powers of the General Staff in motion, and extirpate this mania for the operation. The Army Group has a clear mission to hold, and the highest command will assume all the risk. 2 days later, Hitler removed Leib on grounds of health and replaced him with Kuchla. Leib's chief of staff was also replaced. By the 11th, the 188th Rifle Division reached the outskirts of Staraya Russa. This move severed the only road supplying the 2nd Corps at Damansk. They were followed by 2 more rifle divisions, all preparing to assault the vital town. Inside Staraya Russa stood about 6,500 Germans defending a 31-kilometer perimeter. 1/3 were hastily armed construction or Luftwaffe personnel. The remainder came from the 18th Motorized Division and some reconnaissance troops from the SS Totenkopf. Although infantry was lacking, the garrison was relatively well supplied with 28 large-caliber artillery pieces and motors alongside 4 88mm flat guns. However, the city's defenses were organized to the east, north, and west. Only the southern sector was held by support troops. From the 12th, Morozov attempted to exploit this situation by attempting to envelop the city with 3 ski battalions and a rifle regiment. On the 13th, they attacked the unguarded southwestern sector of Staraya Russa. 2 battalions managed to cut the main road to Schminsk and the railway line. Ildemannsdorf mounted a desperate counterattack with artillerymen and rear area troops. This destroyed the 2 battalions that had entered the city, but it could not dislodge the troops encircling it. With the railway severed, the garrison was now entirely dependent on Le Flotte 1 for aerial resupply. Following the failure of the flanking attack, Morozov brought up artillery to shell the garrison into submission. Meanwhile, the 10th Army Corps threw about every possible formation into the line that it could to contain the Soviet advance. This would include the SS police battalions normally reserved for rear-line security. Hasan had also began planning a counterattack using the slowly arriving battalions from the 81st Infantry Division. This week, the 34th Army launched its attack on the 290th Division. Its strong points were too widely spread to mutually support another, allowing easy infiltration between them. Rapidly, the supply lines were cut, and they were picked off one by one. Once the breach in the line grew large enough, they sent the 202nd Rifle Division to cut the Logistical railway line. The 290th Infantry Division was now trapped between both the 11th and 34th Armies. At the same time, the 3rd Army finally managed to concentrate enough forces to make advances, and this would be led by the 257th and 31st Rifle Divisions. These divisions pushed into the rear of the 123rd Infantry Division, slowly forcing it to abandon its strong points to avoid encirclement. This allowed the army to press towards Caen and compelled General Rauch to reorganize his line to cover this penetration. At Caen, a makeshift force of infantry and SS police units was being formed. The first elements of the 218th Infantry Division were rushed by truck towards Caen, and they were accompanied by large stocks of supplies. The rest of the division, with an attached artillery regiment, would be sent as soon as possible, as soon as transport became available. Meanwhile, the 4th Shock Army pressed on towards Toropets. Roughly halfway from Pino, the 60,000-strong Shock Army met a 3,800-strong blocking detachment from the German 189th Infantry Regiment, dug in near Okvat to buy time for reinforcements. On the 13th, the 249th Rifle Division, with a tank battalion, attacked the Germans but could only seize just part of the village. In response, Eremenko deployed his ski troopers to bypass the German regiment. By the 14th, the Germans were completely surrounded. They attempted a breakout on the 15th. Only 160 men would return to German lines at Toropets, but they had delayed Eremenko for several vital days. At the start of the week, Weizmann stood only 120 kilometers south of Konev's forces and 85 kilometers from the nearest of General Zhukov's troops. If this gap were closed, the bulk of 4 German armies could be trapped inside a giant pocket. All of the army commanders could see the danger, yet the German high command still seemed blind to it. Klubler lamented, "The leadership has allowed the operational breakthrough to happen, reacting to none of the reports. We are behaving like the Russians, remaining stationary and allowing ourselves to be encircled." Others like Henrici were becoming near resigned to their impending defeat. In a letter to his wife dated January the 11th, "Everything has come true exactly as I told my superiors. They have declined all suggestions out of fear of the highest authority. If it is Kluge or Kubler, our new commander officer, they are all afraid of the highest authority. And he himself leads according to the platitudes such as no Napoleonic retreat. He leaves the flanks open and gives the enemy all the time in the world to march around us and attack us from behind. One hopes that new divisions will be brought up, but they are coming so slowly and in such small numbers it is simply not good enough to get us out. Thus the Russian is going to win his first battle of annihilation against us. However, it is hard to accept this fate when it is so obvious that the reason for this development is due to the stubbornness of our leaders. There would have been measures to turn things around if they had decided to disengage 3 weeks ago, 14 days ago, even 5 or 6 days ago. We have made suggestions often enough, but the new Army High Commander refused them all, and haggles over whether or not to give up 20 or 1,200 conquered kilometers. And yet it is completely irrelevant where in Russia we are." Yet Hitler could not bring himself to admit that a retreat was needed. In his view, any retreat equaled defeat, a logic that conflicted with the immense distances and strategic depth of the USSR. He remained convinced that reinforcements would arrive to counter the threatened sectors, drawn from quieter parts of the front and from formations arriving from France and Germany. Even Halder was beginning to grow frustrated with this vacillation. On January the 14th, he had this to say: "The Führer realizes the necessity of pulling back, but makes no decision. This kind of leadership can only lead to the annihilation of the army." On the 10th, Hitler announced he wanted to speak with Kluge personally. A snowstorm delayed their meeting till the 11th. Kluge, however, left empty-handed, with Hitler only allowing the retreats that had already caused Hoppner to be fired the previous week. Hitler had wanted to discuss any other topic. When pressed, he stated that every day and every hour the withdrawal was delayed was a gain for the Wehrmacht. There would be no coordinated retreat to the Königsberg line, despite Kluge's urgent wishes to do so. The Stavka demanded Konev capture Ligev by the 11th, and no later than the 12th, even if it meant the destruction of the city. "Seize control of Ligev on January 11th, or in no case later than January the 12th. The Stavka recommends for this purpose the use of all available artillery, modern aviation in the area to hammer the city of Ligev, not stopping short of serious destruction of the city." The German garrison holding Ligev had carved a massive salient into the Soviet breakthrough. The 29th Army tried to envelop the city from the west, reinforced by divisions taken from the 39th Army. Wave upon wave were hurled at the German defenders. One company from the 183rd Rifle Division was reduced to just 6 men. Despite these desperate attacks, the Germans maintained their hold on the city. Simultaneously, the 39th Army was ordered to press on to Sivshevka, led by the 9th Cavalry Corps. There it was hoped to capture the German stockpiles and sever the Vyazma-Sivshevka-Ligev railway line that supplied the 9th Army in a second focus. Sivshevka was reached on the 15th. The forces managed to secure the railway station, but the German defenders still held control of the town itself. Building on the success of the 4th Shock Army, the 22nd Army attacked on the 15th and made rapid gains of up to 120 kilometers. The weak 11th Cavalry Corps had been ordered to exploit the breach created by the 39th Army and sever the German supply lines at Vyazma. It was hoped that they would unite there with Belov's Cavalry Corps, which were approaching through the gap near Kluka. Strauss also fervently desired a withdrawal, as his army found itself double enveloped. A report to the OKH read as such: "The 4th Army, 4th Panzer Army, 3rd Panzer Army, and 9th Army are double enveloped. The absolutely last opportunity to prevent their destruction is to take them into the Heshatsk-Volga position, the Königsberg line, which may free enough strength to eliminate the northern arm of the envelopment west of Ligev." He had been forced to strip the 1st Panzer Division from Reinhardt and rush it to Sevka to block the eastward flank of the 9-kilometer-wide Soviet breach in his lines. Yet Strauss had nothing to prevent the Soviet advance south towards Vyazma. The advancing Soviet cavalry were already compelling Strauss to move his headquarters from Sivchevka to Vyazma. By the 13th, he was pleading with Kluge to permit a withdrawal, but the OKH ignored this report. Strauss wanted to focus the isolated 23rd Corps on the counterattack to seal the breach in his line. On the 15th, however, Kluge bypassed Strauss and ordered the Corps to withdraw 16 kilometers while maintaining its stretch of the line. This was likely intended as a demonstration of no confidence in Strauss. After Kluge refused to modify the order, Strauss demanded sick leave in protest. By the 16th, this request was accepted by Kluge. Walter Molle was promoted, bypassing the seniority of 15 officers in the army group. Molle only made a quick stop at the 9th Army HQ on the 16th due to being ordered to Kluge's HQ and then the Wolf's Lair. There, Molle snubbed meeting Strauss, only meeting Blaurock and the Chief of Staff Hans Krebs to discuss plans. Strauss said, "Molle agreed in a general manner to the plans of the army and proceeded to Army Group Center, and to Hitler without bothering to call upon me." Molle immediately demanded plans to close the gap between the 23rd Corps and the rest of the 9th Army for the following week, and he pressed for the 1st Panzer to be far more aggressive. In an active defensive role from the 17th, they exploited the Soviet lack of heavy weaponry to reclaim several villages. The SS Reich Division was also transferred to Ligev's area to assist the planned counterattack, but the redeployment proceeded rather slowly. It would take until the 12th for Rolf and Rottinger to reach the 4th Panzer Army HQ, leaving them without a commander or a chief of staff for over 3 days. Yet Hoppner's fated withdrawal had saved the Panzer Army from the same pressure bearing down on the 4th Army. The withdrawal of the 20th and 7th Corps shortened the Army's front. Model would have also liked to withdraw across the river Rusa due to the time required to move his vehicles, but Kluge refused. Only Ralph's old 5th Corps was in real danger from Soviet assaults, as it struggled to maintain the connection with the 3rd Panzer Army. If they broke, every single army and Army Group Center would face at least one open flank. That looming danger had also caused Ralph's delay. On the same day Ralph left the 5th Corps, it was transferred to Reinhardt's Panzer Army. Reinhardt would also receive the 27th Corps from the 9th Army. However, much of the 1st Panzer Division was attached directly to the 9th Army. It was hoped that by making Reinhardt directly responsible for these formations, he would act to prevent their collapse. He still demanded more fuel to save the 5th Corps, which Strauss promised to airlift. Despite this, Reinhardt pressed for permission to withdraw due to the encirclement threat, and of course this request was refused. While both panzer armies could handle the majority of Soviet infantry-led assaults, occasional tank-led attacks supported by higher-quality infantry nearly always created major problems. For example, an assault on the 13th would overrun Model's defenses at Bovasovo, Kryanovo, and Ilinskoye, the newly shaped charge Redhead rounds that improved German anti-tank capabilities. However, their large-scale rollout was still slow, and not all formations possessed them in sufficient quantities. Thus, many formations remained reliant on artillery or their Flak 88s for anti-tank duties. Furthermore, both formations' lines were rather leaky, with Soviet ski troops constantly bypassing the dispersed strongpoints that comprised the German defenses. On the 14th, Reinhardt again requested permission to withdraw. When Strauss refused, Reinhardt threatened to issue the order himself, and he would write in his diary, "Has nobody the courage to act before it is too late?" However, Hauptner's example of restraint prevented such action. Instead, Hauptner contacted Kluge, who managed to placate him for the time being. Between the 4th Panzer Army and the 4th Army, there lay a 15-kilometer gap through which the Soviets had breached. The northern linchpin of the 4th Army's defensive line was Moydin. The Soviets attacked the town every day. By the 12th, Kluge was convinced the town had to be abandoned. However, if it fell, the Soviets would have free rein to reach Yukhnov and encircle the 4th Army at the Shancha position. In that area, the remnants of the 4th Corps were packed into a 40 by 32 kilometer zone. A 5th Corps stretched along a 64-kilometer front line west of Yukhnov, defending the road supplying the army. Yet supply to the army was being frustrated by a battalion of Soviet paratroopers that had landed the previous week. After failing to secure their initial objective and without reinforcements, they raided German supply lines and demolished bridges as they steadily worked to rejoin the Soviet lines and link up with the 43rd Army. All of this gave Kluge the leverage to persuade a reluctant Hitler of the need to withdraw from Moydin. He used this as a cover to withdraw the entire 4th Army from the Bulge. Movement, however, could only be conducted at night, as during the day they remained under constant Soviet assault. This constraint slowed progress to a crawl. The 4th Army advanced only 5 to 10 kilometers per day, but with each passing day their position grew stronger as the line shortened and formations became even more concentrated. On the 15th, Hitler finally yielded to the pressure and approved Kluge's withdrawal back to the Königsberg line. Hitler's order read as such: "Since it has not been possible to close the gaps to the north of Milyen and to the west of Rizhev, I grant the request of the Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Center to withdraw the front of the 4th Army, the 3rd and the 4th Panzer Armies to the line east of Yukhnov, east of Gyatsk, and east of Zubstov. It's about 18 kilometers southeast of Rizhev. The resistance line should be placed so that the Yukhnov, Gyatsk-Zubstov road, serving as a link behind the front, remains out of reach of enemy weapons. It is the first time in this war that I have given the order to withdraw a larger section of the front. I expect that this retreat will be completed in a manner that is worthy of the German army. The troops' feeling of superiority over the enemy and their fanatical will to do him the greatest possible damage must also prevail during the retreat." Some formations would need to retreat as much as 75 kilometers, but once completed, Army Group Center's front would be about 100 kilometers shorter. Hitler continued to make demands, for example, that the breakthrough west of Rizhev be closed, Sertynitsy be relieved. He also insisted that the retreat be conducted in a way that the troops' feeling of superiority over the enemy and their fanatical will do him the greatest possible damage but also prevail during the retreat. In a similar vein, on the 17th, Haldor issued a Osterwide order calling for the cessation of what he described as an excessive worship of numbers by staff officers, which he regarded as an insult to the fighting spirit of the soldiers. It is not acceptable that a command should succumb to an obsession with figures, which only emphasizes the large number of units on the enemy's side and the present decline of the fighting power on our side. There will be an end to that situation, which is quite unacceptable to the German general staff, when time and time again the fighting spirit and toughness of our troops have put to shame the worried number worshippers in the staffs. Kluge was only too happy to accept these demands without argument. Now he faced the Soviets rather than his own high command. Yet Rolf and Reinhardt remained forbidden from withdrawing until Kluge gave permission. A free-for-all retreat would have doomed the Fourth Army and the Third Panzer Army. Reinhardt chafed at the restriction until Kluge warned that any disobedience would not be tolerated. The Fourth Army bore the greatest distance to travel and the greatest danger. Its withdrawal to the Königsberg line began immediately and under constant Soviet attack. To the south, both the Second Army and the Second Panzer Army had fully stabilized their lines, expanding a 240-kilometer front. All of their major formations had survived, though at heavy material cost. They had also managed to hold onto the important cities of Bryansk, Oryol, and Kursk. Morale was beginning to recover from its dive during the retreat. An unknown German soldier wrote this: "Well, the most terrible, worst, and most exhaustive days now seem to be behind us, and we have stopped in a village and arranged so-called winter quarters. The front line has come to a halt, and in the spring it is back on the road and forward again, to the final victory." The Panzer and motorized divisions continuously conducted small raids on Soviet forces, preventing any major Soviet buildup against the river line defenses. Hitler lifting the halt order did not apply to the armies. The 53rd Corps stood bulging south of Belep, with 4 weakened divisions and a small battle group from the 3rd Panzer Division, facing constant attacks from over 7 Soviet divisions. Withdrawals was convinced his corps was on the verge of breaking by the 15th, but not only was he denied relief, Hitler insisted that no movement of the corps or its divisions could occur without approval from higher command. This internal drama served as a distraction from the buildup of the relief force for the embattled garrison at Sochinetse. The 24th Corps was assembling a collection of battle groups and other elements drawn from all divisions of the Panzer Army. The 19th Corps was considered the earliest feasible start date for an offensive. The 4,000 German troops isolated at Sochinetse had only intermittent radio contact with the outside world. They managed to resist the relatively passive siege being conducted by the Soviet 10th Army, which they believed had all the time in the world to do so. In addition, the Soviet 50th Army, which was primarily focused on capturing Yoknov, operated in the sector. Meanwhile, Group Belov concentrated on penetrating deep behind German lines and had reached the Warsaw Highway by the end of the week. Schmidt's preparations for an offensive were hampered by a sharp upturn in partisan activity in the rear areas. A substantial number of Red Army soldiers remained at large from the Battle of Bryansk, consolidating into partisan bands. These groups were now receiving supplies from Soviet airdrops and even managing to link up with advanced detachments of Soviet units. Road movement was exceptionally slow due to heavy snowfall, routinely taking more than 9 hours to cover 8 kilometers. On the 15th, the Second Army was transferred to the command of Army Group South to ease some of Kluge's burden. The sole exception was the 35th Corps, which remained attached to the 2nd Panzer Army. On that same day, Maximilian von Weiss recovered from his illness and resumed duty as commander of the 2nd Army. This left Schmidt to concentrate his attention solely on the 2nd Panzer Army and widening the gap between him and the 4th Army. On the 17th, the 17th Corps of the 6th Army attempted an offensive towards Prokhorovo to secure a link with the 2nd Army. However, the 2nd Army could not launch a concurrent attack, limiting the effectiveness of this push. As a result, the Soviet 40th, 21st, and 38th Armies were free to press their offensive towards Kharkiv, though their attacks met strong resistance from the very well-entrenched German 2nd and 6th Armies. On January 13th, Reichenau suffered a stroke. Kleist was initially chosen as a stand-in replacement, but the next day he was replaced by Hoth. That same day, Hitler recalled Field Marshal Bock to become commander of Army Group South. It would not be until the 20th that Bock actually assumed command, as he had been on the furlough in the Austrian mountains after recovering from intestinal issues. A lot of Germans getting sick. Bock would also attend Leichenau's funeral alongside Rundstedt, who had been asked to represent Hitler. Hitler also wanted to have publicity photos with Bock to help oppose the growing concern about the recent exodus of generals from the Eastern Front. And at the end of the week, Marshal Timoshenko prepared an offensive with the Southern Front's 57th, 9th, and 37th Armies, alongside the 1st and 5th Cavalry Corps. The Southwestern Front's 6th Army and the 6th Cavalry Corps were also slated to take part in the planned operation. These forces were to strike the boundary between the 6th German Army and the 17th Armies near Izium, where the Red Army had maintained a small bridgehead across the Donets River. Manstein had assembled enough troops by the 13th to begin planning an offensive against Theodosia. 4 divisions under the 30th Corps were to spearhead the assault, while the 42nd Corps would pin down the 51st Army. A special staff Crimea was formed to coordinate Luftwaffe assets in the theater. Manstein's offensive commenced on the 15th with artillery and aerial bombardment of the 236th Rifle Division's positions. The Soviets were caught by complete surprise, and their forward positions were rapidly overrun by the 46th Infantry Division. The Romanian 8th Cavalry Brigade conducted several feinting attacks on the remainder of the 51st Army. This led the Soviets to believe Vladislavovka was the objective of the operation. Theodosia was left poorly protected. On the 16th, the 170th Infantry Division joined the assault, with the 32nd Infantry joining the evening. A Soviet tank-led counterattack was halted by the few Stug 3 assault guns attached to the 30th Corps. Kozlov decided to use the remaining reserves of the 44th Army and the remaining Black Sea Fleet for another landing at Fudak. The assault was successful and scattered the small Romanian garrison there. They entrenched themselves and did little thereafter. Manstein again simply ignored this flank, sending only a few blocking detachments. On the 17th, the 132nd Infantry Division would attack Theodosia directly. The assault trapped a large portion of the 44th Army. Some units managed to evacuate, but 5,300 men were all captured. The commander of the annihilated 236th Rifle Division escaped only to be convicted by a Soviet military tribunal and executed. He was charged for, quote, for the loss of control of his division. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Stalin pushed multi-front encirclement against army groups Center, North, Leningrad, and Ukraine, betting on reserves and heavy tank action, but logistics and fuel shortages hampered coordination. Stalin insisted on wide front attacks, while Hitler's reluctance to withdraw and growing frantic struggles around Staraya Russa, Izhev, Yen, Yokov all saw German lines gradually shorten under Soviet pressure.